Thank you for your patience, everyone. Today's speaker is Carla Christopher. I always have speakers that I feel like don't need an introduction, and she's actually one of them. She's a pastor, poet, and activist. Carla wears many hats. She is a former poet laureate of York and cultural and diversity trainer and a renewal pastor with the ELCA Lutheran Church. She's received the Key to the City twice, as well as numerous awards for her advocacy, ministry, and education initiatives. So I'm going to turn the time over to Carla. If you are on Zoom, you may ask questions in the chat feature or in the Q&A feature. If you are on Facebook, add questions to the chat area, and I will be monitoring both. And at the end of Carla's presentation, she's going to be answering questions for us. So, thank you, Carla.
Well, hello, and a blessed and joyful day of celebration to each and every one of you. I'm so glad that the gift of technology allows us to be together both in person and through the wonders of the internet, because today I get to share something that is not only so powerfully important to my identity as a multicultural woman of African descent, but also it's part of my family history, part of my family story. You see, when I was born, my last name was Crockett. Now, I am dating myself, but for those who are in my age bracket or a bit older, you may hear the song in your head already, King of the Wild Frontier, because Davy Crockett was a hero in Texas and a very popular folklore figure that when a great number of individuals whose only last name was that of their owners, and they were given a chance to choose a last name, Crockett was one of the most popular to be chosen. I didn't know my family's history on my father's side because records were not kept. We don't have a country of origin. We don't have a tribal affiliation. We don't know what people we are from, and we never will. Because as members of different tribes and countries were brought overseas during the transatlantic slave trade, they were specifically broken up and moved about to make sure that they were not able to preserve their native language, their native religious traditions, their native cultural identity. Much easier to keep people fearful, controlled, divided, if they didn't have the solidarity and the strength that comes from knowing their people. So the slaves in Texas, particularly around the area of Galveston, the only language they knew was English. The only religion they knew was the Christianity that was the religion of their slave owners. And their last names were only the people who owned them, if they had one at all. That is where it turns out my own family comes from. And so when I was tracking down, where does the last name Crockett come from? And it led me to Galveston, Texas. That was when I first uncovered the powerful story of joy, celebration, and freedom that is Juneteenth. And that's why for me, it's a story of incredible meaning. I mean, when we think about it, what exactly is culture, right? Culture is the language that we speak, it's the clothing that we wear, it's how we raise our children, how we decorate our homes, it's the religion and spirituality and the way that we celebrate those amazing things. It's our history, it's our values, right? It's our behavior. Which is the appropriate fork to use? What kind of desserts? How do we greet people that we're meeting for the first time? These are all signs and symbols of our culture. So Juneteenth is a cultural celebration. What does that mean? It means that it's not just a date that commemorates an important time for people of African descent. It's also a day when we lift up and celebrate those things that are unique to African descent individuals, particularly slave descent individuals here in America. So there's lots of parts of Juneteenth that even folks of African descent may not know about because they are not just history facts, they are cultural celebrations. But let's rewind. What is the background of Juneteenth? Where did this day come from? Well, Juneteenth is a contraction of June 19th. And of course, everything starts with the history, right? Where did June 19th come from as a date of huge significance? Well, to understand that, we have to go back even further to the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that happened in 1863, 2 years earlier, about 2.5 years earlier, actually. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, so to speak, by the United States President at the time, Abraham Lincoln, and that freed slaves in 10 states specifically. Only 10? Well, at that point in time, the Union and the Confederacy were in a little bit of a conflict called the Civil War. And there were slaves that were held in the Union states. But because those were already war allies, the Emancipation Proclamation did not specifically apply to those individuals. That was a separate negotiation that would need to be held at a different time. However, there were still approximately 20,000 slaves that were freed immediately by Confederate states that had fallen under Union control by that time in the war. There were also several states, including Texas, that Abraham Lincoln was claiming were in the Union, were in the United States of America, and they had other opinions and beliefs. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was a challenge and a signal to those Confederate states that had not yet been brought back into the Union, letting them know that this is the policy and procedure of the Union, and this is the goal, this is what we are coming for. So, did it instantly free all slaves? It did not. Did that make the Emancipation Proclamation any less important? No, it didn't, because it specifically named that freeing slaves and ending the transatlantic slave trade and the breeding and keeping of domestic slaves in America was a practice that would not be part of this new union going forward. So Juneteenth, June 19th, was the day that Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, the last outpost where Confederate slaves were still being kept. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the push of Union soldiers moved state to state and freed slaves as they arrived. And the very last bastion of slavery that stood was the coast of Texas. And so this southern coast of Texas, as the Union troops arrived, and let them know, because social media was not available to tell them via Facebook, hey, by the way, you've been declared free. These individuals were so thrilled to know that the war had been won, that their slavery had been granted, and that a new life could begin across the country. That June 19th became a day of celebration. So now, how does that presidential decree that led to the freeing of the last of the slaves in America turn into a holiday that's still celebrated in 2021? How was that first Juneteenth celebrated, and how can we celebrate it today? Well, the first Juneteenth, held in 1866, the first anniversary of the Day of Freedom, originally had many names. Biblically, there is a concept in the Old Testament called Jubilee, which Jewish people are called to celebrate approximately every 7 years, where all debts are canceled, all slaves are freed. See the connection there? And all people practice liberation, forgiveness, reunification. It is the healing of all divisions and the release of all things being held. Now, Jubilee, there's minimal evidence that even in ancient Jewish communities it was actually practiced, but it was recorded as that aspirational goal that is something that we need as the reset button for our spirits. And so the original Juneteenth was celebrated as Jubilee Day, because even though Christianity was the religion of the slave owners, it became a real source of hope and connection for people of African descent, because there were certain stories that they truly identified with. And one of those most commonly lifted up in interviews that happened after slavery, when the American government, to capture living history projects, was interviewing the descendants of slaves or freed slaves, the story of Moses and the freeing of the slaves when the Hebrews were in Egypt was something that was named frequently. And of course, we also know Harriet Tubman, one of our most well-known African descent figures, was nicknamed Moses, right, because of her leading individuals to slavery. So we have this story of liberation in the Bible that had to do with the freeing of the Hebrew slaves, and that was something that became a point of connection for the people of African descent. And so Jubilee Day was this wonderful anniversary of that freedom, the canceling of debts, the freeing of slaves, the reunification of families, and the forgiveness of separation and trauma that could cause a bitterness that could keep us from being able to move forward. It was also known as Emancipation Day or Freedom Day, because one of the traditions that was at almost all of those original Juneteenth or Jubilee Day celebrations was a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. That was frequently a center point of the day, a reminder that our freedom is something that we deserve, something that we worked hard to contribute to, and something that we must not forget we have every right to pursue and to defend. So over time, Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Emancipation Day came together as Juneteenth. And those early celebrations not only included reading the Emancipation Proclamation, but grew to include the singing of what now is known as the Black National Anthem, which is Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is a wonderful poem that became a hymn, and we'll hear more about that later. Also, historical plays and reenactments, and reading empowering poems or essays by people of African descent. Why this emphasis on history, shared verbally? Because that was the primary message of sharing history and education that was available to people of African descent. We have to remember that particularly in Texas and some of the more deep southern states, the education of slaves was still illegal. So we're just beginning to have public resources allowing for reading and for more formal education to be an option available to people of African descent. So traditional methods of sharing information and passing on history that came from Africa were still the key way that important things were translated between generations. Through acting, through theater, through storytelling and poetry, through song and through dance, through repetition and recitation. This is how history was preserved. It's how it was taught. It's how it was shared from grandparent to child, from children to younger siblings. And it was how news traveled and how that history was preserved. Unfortunately, that means there's not a lot of written records about those earliest days. But there are stories that are still cherished in communities that are retold now. And in York, the celebration of Juneteenth was a cherished community celebration all the way up through the 80s, before finally beginning to die out as the economic change, right? Our manufacturing community that had sustained individuals for generations eventually destabilized to the point that there was so much movement and people moving in, moving away, communities being broken up, that the same preservation of stories and cultural celebrations was not as prominent. But the happiest of happy endings is that over the last several years, local faith communities and community organizations have come back together, and Juneteenth is now celebrated in multiple locations all around York City and into York County, because the songs never stop being sung. So I wanted to lift up some of my favorite cultural traditions that are part of Juneteenth around the world. Well, at least around our little part of the world, right? But now Juneteenth is actually celebrated in different places in Africa and Europe, where Americans have gone to become part of those communities or return to travel, and recognizing that celebration of freedom has become something that is remembered globally as a story of victory that can inspire people even in other countries. It's nice to think about America being a source of inspiration and freedom, isn't it? I wanted to share with you a piece of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the pieces that is so frequently read. That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thereforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the state and parts of the state, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such state shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. That's pretty complex wording. What on earth does that mean? It means that people of every race are called to fight for the freedom of all Americans, and that any action taken to offer freedom to those being enslaved is an act of liberation, and that any act which seeks to preserve the slavery, the oppression of another individual, that is an act of rebellion. And that when we have individuals who are fighting for their freedom, for their government representation, that those individuals are not in rebellion of the United States, because that is exactly who we are called to be. That the government of this country was founded on rebelling against several countries that were oppressing and removing the freedom of personal choice from individuals. And so it is deeply un-American to enslave or to strip the freedom of any human within these borders. That was about as radical as you could get. And yet, how is it a radical question when that is indeed the very reason that the first colonizers came here? So that debate, which I will not try to settle today, because I know that it is still something that we wrestle with, right? What does freedom mean? What do borders and boundaries mean? What is acceptable to do when you feel that your freedom is being taken from you? How are we called to support and uplift each other? There's a lot of views on that. But hopefully Juneteenth is a day that we can come together and recognize that the safety, that the care, that the celebration of life and of liberty is something that crosses borders and boundaries. And that when we do struggle to understand how we can come together, that we make a commitment to work together and honor the different cultures and traditions that exist in this country. And that freedom for one cannot mean oppression of another. So we are somehow called in this tough thing that is democracy to wrestle with how we can care for each other and celebrate each other in all the ways that we are both similar and different. So obviously, if we can see that in 2021, that's still a challenge, I think we can assume that in 1865, it was just as hard. So how do we take a break from that intensity and just be in the joy of having one more day to move forward? Well, barbecue sauce, of course. Red velvet cake. That's my personal favorite. What? Well, in the unity of celebrating both American culture and African culture, it wasn't just the intense remembering of government's fights for freedom, of the freeing of slaves, the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the telling of historical facts and details, was also followed by a prayer and praise service, usually the reading of the Moses story and of the Exodus. But then that prayer and praise celebration was followed by that great unifier, fabulous meal. Now, Texas food remains across the country the traditional food of the Juneteenth meal. So a good, delicious fried chicken, briskets, cornbread, tasty barbecue foods and Texas foods that are familiar and beloved to so many of us, but primarily foods that are the color red. What? But why? Well, the red represents the blood of the slaves that was spilled. And it is a way to honor those ancestors. And also, it is a tradition that managed to survive because several tribes in Africa see the color red as the color of power and the color of spirit. And so we can honor our ancestors, also an important African descent tradition. And we can honor the power of spirit that liberates us, that is unable to be enslaved or contained. We can follow that fire the same way that a pillar of fire led the followers of Moses in the desert. They followed cloud by day and fire by night. So the power of the color red, its reminder of blood and fire, is a reference to the biblical Exodus It is also a tie to indigenous African spirituality, and it is a way to honor the ancestors. So even today, drinking red Kool-Aid or red juice, red velvet cake for dessert, barbecue because of the red sauce that might be on any of those meats, beet salads, those red foods are core to any Juneteenth meal. So aside from red rice and beans or red sausage, some of my favorites, right? We also have that celebration that involves dance and song. And I mentioned earlier that Lift Every Voice and Sing is known as the Black National Anthem. It's also a favorite church hymn. It was publicly performed first as a poem that was part of a celebration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And there were the Johnson brothers. One wrote the poem, the other was a musician who set it to music. It was in 1919, so considerably some time after the initial Juneteenth, that song became known as the Black National Anthem. But many people don't know the story of why that song is the Black National Anthem. And it comes out of the story of Juneteenth. The fact that this was inspired as a song of freedom and liberty, that was turned into a poem by an individual who was alive and who was the descendant of slaves, right? And then after that writing, honoring the ancestors, honoring the parents, because the Johnson brothers were born in 1871 and 73, right after the end of slavery. This song and this poem were inspired by Abraham Lincoln and the fight for slavery, and then performed at an anniversary of the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so as this celebration was spreading across the country in the very early 1900s, now that technology allows people to communicate more widely, right? We now have people of African descent able to send telegrams and letters. We have the spread of the railroad. So it's not just a local Texas celebration. It's now able to spread exponentially more quickly because of the growth of mass communication. As the 1920s and 1930s have news that is spreading, that is when this song became deeply associated with the celebration of Juneteenth because of its ties to Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And then the NAACP officially dubbed it the Negro National Anthem, now known as the Black National Anthem. Power in voicing a cry for liberation and affirmation for Black people. And the words of the poem, lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that our dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. We can see how that would connect and continue to inspire generations after the freeing of the slaves, can we not? So how can we continue to participate and support Juneteenth, a uniquely African-inspired and African-American generated holiday, as allies, as community partners, as people who may or may not have descendants that were tied to slavery? Well, we can absolutely participate in church-based or congregational celebrations of Juneteenth because of the concept of shared faith. We can support or attend Juneteenth celebrations that may be online or in person that are facilitated by people of African descent. York indeed has many. We can use this to honor the Juneteenth traditions of education and preservation of history by doing things like learning about Juneteenth, attending lectures, reading books, doing research on the wonders of the World Wide Web, using interactive activities or other community resources. We can not only learn about the history of Juneteenth and the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, we can find way to use what resources or avenues we have to teach others. Something as simple as sharing this video with friends and saying, did you know some of these things about Juneteenth? I didn't, is honoring the spirits of those ancestors. Purchasing books on Juneteenth written by Black authors and sharing them with young people that you may have a relationship with honors the spirit of those ancestors. Sharing on social media, asking if the congregation where you attend might teach about this song, or the next time this hymn is used, to put something small in the program or the bulletin that says, by the way, this is not just a hymn, it is the Black national anthem because of the way it tells the story of the freedom fought for by brave people of African descent. These are all things that we can do that honor the history and tradition as initially intended. We can also uplift and support cultural offerings by people of African descent. Because of the importance of dance, music, and poetry as storytelling and teaching and cultural preservation methods that were popular from the African descent community when it was the only option. When we attend plays, purchase books of poetry, albums, share songs and music videos, quilts, using quilt art, right? When we visit museums and we see the exhibits that share the contributions of African descent artists, that is paying homage to the original spirit of Juneteenth. We are allowing those cultural sharings to preserve history and to raise awareness. And we can also act in cooperation with organizations that are led by or that actively support people of African descent in the continued quest for freedom. Obviously, there are issues such as voter suppression, unfair funding in education, housing challenges. There is still a great deal of oppression that has its roots in laws that were enacted during or just after slavery during Reconstruction that we are working to untangle, right? In many places here in York County, there are still homes that were built as late as the 50s and 60s that have people of African descent not allowed to purchase this home or be in this housing development. Now, those laws are still not enforced, but they are still present in the paperwork and the housing deeds that folks are purchasing in houses now, right? No one has actually gone back and removed those and changed the deed of the house that was built, if it was built before the ending of the Jim Crow laws. So we still have work to do. And continuing to do that work is a way that we can honor Juneteenth in spirit and in truth. I encourage you to do everything you can to learn more about the wonderful holiday that is Juneteenth and the rich traditions that make it up, and to learn about the different communities that are celebrating today. But I would also love, if there's anything that I can answer now, to answer any questions that we may have from our Zoom or Facebook participants. Hello, everybody. Or here, any questions or comments to share as a follow-up, any other ideas that you have, or challenge or pushback I welcome the dialogue. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes, I love that folks are typing. Yes, any comments, thoughts, questions? It's a lot. I know it's a lot of history.
I lived here a long time. I lived here since 1940.
Oh my goodness, we have an audience member who's lived here since 1940.
Yeah.
Amen.
And I lived on College Avenue, which is right around the corner from Green Street, where a lot of black people live, but they weren't allowed to live on College Avenue. I always thought that was funny.
Yes, our audience member that's here, one of them remembers living in the area of College and Green Street, that there were a lot of people of African descent who lived around Green Street back in the 40s, but were not allowed to live on College Avenue. And it's tough. There's a wonderful local historian named Scott Mingus who was doing a lot of research and found some of the ads that were for indentured servants and enslaved people that were actually being sold here in Pennsylvania, and which is incredibly challenging. And I did not print up that ad, but there was a ad that he found in a newspaper for a Black woman, and that was not how she was described in the newspaper, but that this young woman still had 5 years left to serve, came with a 2-year-old boy, and also a 4-year-old mulatto girl that were for sale to the highest bidder here in York County. So while it was not a legally enshrined practice in our northern law, it was certainly a practice that did occur in our region. So this is part of our personal story and history that either indentured servants, right, that term of 5 years, or for a 4-year-old child, clearly not an indentured servant. So that would have been either the descendant of a slave or a slave or a child that was purchased, which we would refer to as trafficking right now. And that trade was continuing through York County. So we do have another question.
We have a question, Jane Ordway Carmen, well, first of all, you're spectacular. I just wanted you to know that. But also, she would like to know if you have any book recommendations that you could share. So any top of your reading list suggestions?
Yes, there is a wonderful book that is based on the story of sort of the York history of people of African descent, which I know one of my dear friends and favorite local historian, Jim McClure, contributed to frequently. And I don't actually have the title off the top of my head, but I do have, I know the PDF has just been made available online. So what I promised to do, my Facebook and YouTube viewers.
Almost forgotten.
Yes, almost forgotten. I have amazing stuff. You know, you'd think that I was actually at the York County History Center where people have vast knowledge. The book is called Almost Forgotten. And it is just a top-notch collection of York history. So please, if you just Google it now that the text is available online, please look up Almost Forgotten. It will help you learn so much about York's untold history. Any other questions? It is very, it's wild to hear about the fact that our beloved York, you know, was a place where there were certain streets that folks were able to live. And I know there's a wonderful place that's one of my favorite in York, which is the York Center for Community Engagement, which is part of York College now. And that is a wonderful community outreach place that used to be a private men's club. And the first time that I went into the York Center for Community Engagement, there was a woman of African descent who was in her 60s, and I was holding a gathering for women creatives. We were doing a story circle, sharing poetry and sharing stories. And she walked in, and she was in her late 60s. And as she stood up to speak, she just began to cry. Tears poured down her face. And I said, you're here sharing supportive women space with folks that want to hear your story and your poem. Why is this triggering tears? And she said, because I wasn't allowed to walk past this building as a little girl. I had to walk in the alley behind it because places on Market in Philadelphia Street were not open to me as a Black person. That's why we have all these alleys behind that go the full length of the roads, because that's where non-white people needed to travel to get to the places they worked. So they were allowed to work downtown, but had to leave when work was done. And so when you look at a lot of these older homes, how they have these very comprehensive alleyway systems and exits and entrances in the front and the back, that is not just a choice of architecture. It was a way to allow the non-white people to have access to their workplaces without being on the streets they weren't allowed to be on. And she said, I remember being a little 4- and 5-year-old girl wanting to walk past this building because it was so beautiful, and I was not allowed to. And this was many years ago, and I still remember and can see her face, and to know that we have come a long way was a special gift.
When was that?
That would have been
Not when all that was going on, but when this girl you were talking to?
well, I spoke to her in about 5 years ago, and she was remembering something from the late 40s.
This is an older lady now.
Yes, this was much older.
She's still living here?
She is still living.
Okay.
She is still living and still here in York, fighting for it every day. Were there any other questions that came in from the chat?
Not so far.
Wonderful.
That's about it.
So we'll make one last call. If you have any other comments or stories to share, please let me know and type them in real quick. But I definitely want to say before we shut this down that I want to thank all of you, right? This is a tough conversation to have. And it's tough to wrestle with the things we love about York, the things we love about America, the progress that we've made, and the challenges we had to go through to get here, and the work we still have to do. This is not a clear-cut conversation, it's a messy one. And there are wonderful people of every race, of every culture, that are doing so much to educate, to preserve, to uplift, to support, especially our friends at the York County History Center, which I want to offer tremendous gratitude because they really prioritized having this story told. They have done so much to gather living history and other stories from York community before we no longer have those wonderful individuals with us to tell those stories. And so I just really need to thank them for the work that they do in the community to make sure that all our different histories are preserved. And I'm grateful for them to be here today and for the learning I've done when I have been able to visit the History Center. But keep telling your stories, keep learning, right? Because the gifts of history keep unfolding. The things that I learned as a young girl, a lot of them, it turns out the story wasn't being all the way told. So I kept learning. History is not something that is done. It is indeed a gift that keeps unfolding. So any final thoughts, questions, stories?
Nothing? Well, we don't have any questions. But it was just, Jane again, she just wanted you to know how much she felt everyone who has participated today. And she
Thank you so much for those that are sharing the love in the chat. This is just my heart work. I love York. It is my home. It is my family. Some days I don't even understand why I love it like I do. But I know that if something can be done here in York, it can be done anywhere because we've got everything right here. And if we can do it here, we can do it everywhere. So that's why we keep fighting for York. That's why we keep working together to rebuild York. That's why we keep celebrating what has already been done in York. We are a tough cookie of a county. And I am so honored to be part of this land, of this community with each and every one of you. A blessed Juneteenth to all of you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Home and online, you as well. Thank you for being with us. Have a great month of celebration.
Good.